Hundreds of Ukrainian drones penetrated Russia. On the night from Wednesday to Thursday, dozens targeted Moscow, once again disrupting flights to and from the capital. The Russian Ministry of Defense stated that its forces had shot down 286 Ukrainian drones in 12 regions. We can see that the Ukrainians are taking hits, but they are clearly able to strike back as well. The Russian defense also can't stop everything.
These low-cost missiles are transforming long-range aerial warfare. Both sides suffer because they can't defend themselves. The key difference is that the Russians are causing the population to suffer. The Ukrainians target civilians to draw defenses away from the front lines, while the Ukrainians, on their side, they target military infrastructure including fuel and ammunition depots, factories and military bases. Despite Russia's highly reputed pre-war defenses, attacks are still getting through, showing the army's transformation. However, the structural change we're witnessing in Ukraine is achieving remarkable results, implementing low-cost, low-intensity and low-tier systems. French cruise missiles cost 500,000 each, while alternatives mentioned here are 10 to 20 times cheaper to achieve similar military effects. On the other hand, if you had to hit a fuel depot that's deep underground, where you need to get through 6 meters of concrete, that's where our high-quality systems come in. However, we lack a range of low-cost options to complement them, like the ones they can have, and thanks to which they...
The world is adapting to new ways of waging war, with some managing to pull off innovative moves for the first time. This war is changing
the situation. We did manage to turn the attack around, but if the Ukrainians had fought the war in a normal way, they would have collapsed. The imbalance of power, particularly in military equipment, was to their disadvantage despite having more soldiers. If they had agreed to fight a normal war, they would have lost it. They won the Black Sea battle without any boats of their own. The Ukrainians successfully defend against the larger Russian army daily. Despite being on defense and using drones, they still dominate in drone technology. That's the essence of it.
The key since the beginning. Have they hit some Achilles' heels? Among the targets was the Ubna machine-building plant, which produces aviation, missile and drone technologies. We had some
fuel depots. We had chemical plants that also produce fuel for certain missiles. Last week, fiber optic factories, Shahed drone production facilities, and optical systems exploded. Ultimately, the panel and its consistency are what matter. The sites we're dealing with are well-selected, structuring, and strategic. Obviously, there's also the aspect of relying on the Russian economy by hitting fuel depots. And that, in the end, creates an ecosystem. We're pressuring the Russian economy and military. This means we'll reduce the offensive capability of the Russian army, which would be much stronger without these deep strikes. And we're impoverishing Russia by preventing it from exporting its fuel and energy.
Is it true that France, Germany, the United Kingdom, as well as Russia or Ukraine would not be able to stop waves of...
Drones are a certainty in Ukraine today, and they are now much more capable of self-defense than before. Intercepting hundreds of kamikaze drones, even if just Shahed drones, is done mostly with heavy machine guns firing into the sky. I've spent nights with them. We have zero. We don't have any. And it's not with our Aster-10 and Aster-30 missiles, which are 100% effective. But it takes 5 years to produce them. It's 5 years from the start of production to assembly before we can manage to intercept.
3,000 drones per month? It's a fascinating and somewhat worrying picture. It must be said that we're discovering a conventional war, not at all dealing with nuclear weapons. But still, war is possible in Europe, in Western Europe.
We fear it. And there are warning signs of a shift, a reorientation of the Russian army toward us. The installations on the Finnish borders, the repeated violations of NATO borders, shooting at helicopters in the Black Sea, violating our airspace without us reacting. Besides.
And everything is being reshuffled. Who is weak, who is strong? Because in my generation, there were still ideas. We used to say the Americans and the Russians, Soviet Russia. It's super powerful, then it goes down and so on. No, now we see that anything is possible. Actually, it's not about the weak and the strong. It's about the crazy one
facing the strong one. NATO is infinitely stronger. If we give ourselves 3 months, get organized, stand face-to-face in a field and prepare, we win. If Russia gathers hundreds of thousands of troops at the border in a show of force, it may just be for barracks in 2 weeks. We can't match Russia's force in the Baltics. What if it attacks in 2 weeks after rebuilding its forces? After a 2-3 year ceasefire with Ukraine, we won't have time to reinforce. And so, to reconquer territories that might have been taken, especially, for example, in Lithuania, to isolate the 2 northern Baltic countries. That's what frightens us in the General Staff.
Did we underestimate the tactical intelligence of the Russians here? That is, this strategy of the weaker side. But who knows, they can provoke the strong, knowing the strong won't strike back due to the nuclear umbrella. It works, at least partially. I think that
We shouldn't have kept backing down. Turkey was right to shoot down a Russian plane that violated their airspace, and they weren't bothered after that. If we had responded in 2014 when they first violated our airspace, we would be in a better position today.
you're avoiding action. If we were braver, the situation would be better, but Crimea remains occupied. 11 years later, it's clear that NATO, which is the most powerful alliance of all time, doesn't dare confront Russia. We have
Given our surplus and a few samples of our good equipment, and it's thanks to that that Ukraine has managed to hold on. We made a political choice, particularly the Americans, because I believe we gave as much as we possibly could. American politicians chose not to allow Ukraine to win when they stopped the Ukrainians from attacking the Russians evacuating Kherson. It's an American decision that was made official last October. So we also didn't give the necessary equipment to the Ukrainians to win when they had the
big accounts.
offensives, out of fear of a Russian collapse, out of fear of the use of nuclear weapons.
Their declared red lines from the start ultimately proved to be false.
Providing artillery is not allowed, and close combat equipment like tanks is also prohibited.
No fighter jets, no long-range missiles, no strikes on our own Russian territory.
All of that is in the past. How far will this go? What if they attempt an operation in the Baltic states next? We can only imagine their intentions. There are still people like Gerasimov, who may be old-fashioned military men, but who have theorized about this. Maybe the West won't dare to commit the armies too far because we don't want to fall into nuclear conflict. Today, there is no chance that Russia could have the massive
maneuvers to attack us. But if there is indeed an operational pause of 1 or 2 years in Ukraine, if they maintain their current recruitment and equipment production pace with 5,000 to 6,000 armored vehicles, 1 million men, and 25,000 cruise missiles, it is indeed sufficient. I don't believe for a moment that the countries of Europe wouldn't react if there were a Russian assault. It's just that we take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month before we get there. As revealed in the leaks, the Russians bombed our airports and trains to prevent us from leaving.
But what does it mean to react? Does it mean waging a conventional war, pitting armies against entire continents? Or does it mean striking much more boldly inside Russia?
If Russia attacks Europe and NATO, strikes will occur deep inside Russia, not limited to 186 miles like Ukraine's current strikes, but much deeper. Those who show their will.
In this sense, the Germans have completely changed, as if they suddenly felt it themselves. Threatened.
They use various non-lethal means below the level of war, but they understand they are in countries that must defend themselves. The Germans are positioning troops on Dutch soil to be in close proximity to the Russians in order to...
There's a German panic that needs to be stopped quickly. It reminds me of a former German attitude. First, they have pro-Russian circles. They've been gorging themselves on Russian gas. Suddenly, they're thinking the United States isn't protecting them as much, so they may need to rediscover their military spirit.
France has been advising them to be powerful for 50 years, which they ignored. This is also important in case American and European interests diverge. So, yes, the Germans are doing it, but again, if a front were to open on the NATO side, on the European side, you must realize that we've provided Ukraine with 15–30% of our supplies in specific areas. In other words, if Scalp missiles were ever needed, we have 3 to 5 times more than what we've provided to Ukraine. So the numbers would obviously be even more in our favor than...
In the current situation, the Russians are extremely sensitive to that. German weapons in particular that could strike inside Russia. Lavrov, their foreign minister, obviously finds that very irritating.
Germany is directly involved in the war, repeating the same mistakes it has made multiple times in the last century. This led to its collapse. I hope the responsible politicians of this country will draw the right conclusions from it. We need to stop the madness.
We need to stop the madness. They know that they're...
It's a very sensitive point, but they want to stop the madness. Why are the Germans providing new systems? Because the Russians did not accept the ceasefire that Zelensky agreed to in March. As Russia continues to escalate, there is a rebalancing. It's never an escalation or a provocation or an aggression from the Germans and the allies of Ukraine. It's simply that we're following, with a lot of delay, the disasters and the aggressions and the assaults and the deaths caused by Russia. They desire peace. The Russians can have it tonight. As long as they perform poorly, we will obviously continue providing more equipment to the Ukrainians. The worrying part is that they don't
seem that scared, apparently. If they were really afraid, they
would seize the opportunity for a ceasefire. If they weren't afraid, they wouldn't talk about it either. But I think they're also following a leader who's just running forward blindly. If Putin decides to stop today, his government will collapse and the economy won't hold up. They have no choice but to continue this war. If they stop the war without taking the 4 officially announced regions, it will be a partial failure.
The mass of soldiers organized by the Russians at the gates of Europe, we already discovered that last night. Other information and details are coming in today. There are 125,000 men massed at the gates of Europe. Potential attacks could be carried out, including against Kharkiv, the large eastern Ukrainian city with 1 million inhabitants. Last year, the
Russians did exactly the same thing. I am convinced that the Russians will try one last time to launch a major offensive, hoping to have more success than last year, when they attempted to capture Kharkiv in April to May 2024. Despite having fewer artillery, shells and inability to jam glide bombs, the Ukrainians successfully blocked the enemy forces. So today, if the Russians have a maneuver force of 50 to 60,000 men, it's not something we don't see coming. If there is a significant accumulation of Russian troops on the ground, Ukraine also has a strategic reserve and has laid mines on their side. With all the preparation, I believe this offensive will fail. At least I hope so. The Ukrainians seem better prepared than last year, despite the Russians having more equipment. It will be a failure, and it's only after this future failure that the Russians would really start to consider a ceasefire.
All of this is happening under the Russian nuclear umbrella for the Russians. These are the revelations we talked about earlier from Spiegel. We really need to stop and think about it. Because for months, investigators have gone through millions of documents about Russian military purchases. To get their hands on secret nuclear facility plans, there are some all over the country. Russia is modernizing its missile infrastructure, especially near the Kazakhstan border, according to these classified documents. Satellite images analyzed by the Danish investigative group Danwatch and the major newspaper Der Spiegel. We're going to look at a few of them. There are hundreds, even thousands, but just a few of these satellite images explain to us. What Spiegel says is that you can even see the seismic sensors, the electrical circuits, the camera networks, and the explosion-resistant doors. That means we know
Exactly what the strengths and weaknesses of the defense system are, which means the sensors to detect incoming missiles and the protection systems. The ventilation systems, posters on the walls, and purchased sports equipment are all included. We know everything from A to Z. How do the toilets drain? We know everything. So actually, if we wanted to disrupt their detection system, we know exactly where the radars are now to prevent them from working. So overall, I think this is the worst leak of classified documents in the history of the world's military. All journalists and the entire population are at the same knowledge level as the agents of the
CIA up to now. How can we explain the importance of the silos? I thought that now nuclear missile submarines. We'll discuss the Rafale with a Rafale pilot who will join us shortly, who carried the weapon. They still heavily rely on silos, particularly in terms of volume, much more than traditional silos.
Nuclear submarines are extremely costly to operate. In fact, they only have around a dozen, possibly 13 or 14 in total. And so each of these submarines can carry about 10, 15 or 16 nuclear missiles. And so in the end, it's true that there are very, very few of them at sea. Russia claims to possess around 5,000 nuclear missiles and warheads, with over 1,500 deployed. And so yes, the vast majority are rather ground-to-ground. So it can actually be launched from silos, fired from large vehicles like the Topol, or launched from systems that move on rails. But overall, the vast majority of their nuclear capability is that. And then there are the missiles that will be...
Strategic bombers launch these. Looking at the satellite images, you have a more trained eye than we do. What can we make out on satellite images of this kind? We will display them. What we
see overall is the evolution of the land where we have new buildings. That means expansions. That means they're not just renovating their traditional facilities anymore. It implies they might replace a base with 1 or 2 silos to put 4, significantly expanding the site.
That is to say, there is
potentially more storage that is possible. For air bases, more missiles and logistics are needed to restore operations quickly after an attack. We've fired and are preparing the next salvo. More people who can hide underneath, possibly research centers. So in this case, there are so many photos that have been shared that we don't know exactly which one it could be. But we see investments in nuclear that were easily confirmed starting in 2018 when Putin gave that big speech. With the new strategic weapons, etc. The development of future weapons like the Sarmat, which we've discussed before, remains challenging, with failures, with missed launches, with explosions on the launch pad. In any case, they are investing resources to renew their nuclear arsenal as these missiles were reaching the end of their service life.
There is a kind of nuclear hysteria. The bases were rebuilt from the ground up with hundreds of new barracks, watchtowers, control centers, warehouses, and vast underground tunnels. Russia is the largest country on Earth, despite losing 25% of its territory after the Soviet Union's fall. And they had some leeway, as you say, and everywhere they fill their country.
However, it's beneficial that they're investing and squandering funds on something not applicable to their conflict in Ukraine.
And it's even better if they keep going.
But what's dramatic for them now is starting from scratch. We know where each of these tunnels is. We know the global positioning system location. We can destroy them. Well, we can. In a real war, their secret planes and bases would no longer remain secret.
They are at war in its danger.
So yes, indeed, but the Americans certainly have... Which is not negligible, let's be honest. However, all these investments, efforts, and tens of billions of dollars they've invested, today we can consider that since they're no longer secret, they're visible now, finally... Targetable. I don't remember how to say to target. Relatively more easily than what we could get in the past, and so they almost have to start over.
Chancellor Kohl stated, the Soviet Union is Upper Volta, an impoverished African nation armed with missiles. They claim it was a gas station equipped with missiles, which has some truth to it. That is to say, they have considerable economic difficulties, but they invest massively in nuclear weapons. They know very well that today their
conventional army is no longer frightening. We had overestimated it. We had overestimated their missiles, their planes, their helicopters, and it collapsed. Despite 3 years of intense fighting, Russia has failed to take control of the Donbas region in Ukraine.
And besides that, to keep us afraid, indeed, they want to have a deterrent capability. I wouldn't mess with Russian deterrence.
Even if half of them fail, that's still 500 missiles that can reach Europe. So, overall, if they give up or stop investing, they disappear from the big leagues. They will become an army smaller than China's, yet they still aspire to be the world's second largest army today. Even if, on the ground, they certainly wouldn't be anymore.
You are very knowledgeable about these things. What stands out is that there is always a margin of uncertainty. The Yars, we've had information about these Yars missiles for a few days now, and it seems very primitive. When you see these images, these big trucks driving through the forest, you'd think that logically American intelligence must be aware of it, but all the experts tell us no. Maybe they could launch Yars missiles and France wouldn't be ready to intercept them.
The issue with the Yars is that it's an evolution of a previous system, after 40 years of having these trucks driving around in the snow. Yes, they already need to be replaced. Not necessarily to increase capacity, not necessarily to increase volume, but simply a missile. It's been 30 years, the fuel inside needs to be changed. And so the Yars, which is the next generation, but which was also partly designed with the Ukrainians, apparently the various tests that have been carried out have failed. Today we will discuss something fixed, easy, familiar, and well established. Especially with these leaks, we know where to strike to prevent it. We know, but...
Generals warned some missiles could reach Europe. Let's not deceive ourselves.
If Russia launches nuclear bombs at Europe, everyone, including Russians, will die, as Europe will retaliate and destroy Russia in the same manner. But the IARs are precisely able to ensure certainty because these are mobile installations. And so, logically, it's made to be dispersed across the territory. Satellite photos are needed to track the dozens of them across the territory, as real-time tracking everywhere is not feasible.